It was always going to be a tough week back for the new government, with the heady July election now feeling a world away. But the final and damning report into the Grenfell fire, which took the lives of 72 people, dominated the debate today, with the tragedy and scandal casting a long shadow over Westminster itself. What will now change? What can the new government change? Welcome to Talking Politics. Hello and welcome back to Talking Politics with me, Julie Etchingham. Alongside Robert and Anushka, it was the first PMQs back after the summer break, a break which of course the PM didn't take because of the horrors of Southport and the riots which followed. Sir Keir Starmer has already set a sombre tone with his Rose Garden speech last week, warning how tough the coming months and indeed the October budget might be. That was the subject of some pretty animated exchanges with Rishi Sunak this week, as was the decision to halt some arms sales to Israel. But all that felt a bit secondary today in the light of the final and damning report into the tragedy and the political scandal of the Grenfell fire. Straight after PMQ, Sir Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak delivered their responses.
I want to start with an apology on behalf of the British state to each and every one of you, and indeed to all of the families affected by this tragedy. It should never have happened. This tragedy poses fundamental questions about the kind of country we are, a country where the voices of working class people and those of colour have been repeatedly ignored and dismissed. So this must be a moment of change, because a safe and decent home is a human right and a basic expectation, and the provision of that right should never be undermined by the reckless pursuit of greed.
Today's publication, as the Prime Minister said, is, to put it bluntly, a damning indictment of over 30 years of successive state failures. Sir Martin Morbick and the work of the inquiry have painted a picture of systemic indifference, failure, and in some notable cases, dishonesty and greed. As a Prime Minister, current or former, you are a custodian of the state. And its failures, whether on your watch or not, are something that you feel deeply.
The key points to note in an incredibly powerful speech by the Prime Minister, acknowledged there by Rishi Sunak himself. The apology on behalf of the British state underpinned everything that he said. He talked very directly to the families, didn't he, that were listening in the gallery. I mean, just the sense that they are there on this day, I think, fills that moment with great weight. He said, after all you've been through, you must have felt that you were only ever one step away from another betrayal. He talked about what they'd already been through and then what they had to face in the aftermath of the fire. He said, there must now be a day of justice. There should be accountability through the criminal justice system, that the government will look at all 58 of the recommendations in the report. There will be a response in 6 months. But I think, and I suppose this is where I'd quite like to start our discussion of what we've heard, is this, this insight into the fact that Sir Keir Starmer has visited Grenfell Tower and not simply laid a wreath, potent and required and the right thing to do that is, as a memorial, but he'd clearly been inside Grenfell Tower and it had clearly affected him incredibly deeply. He now wants to create what happens next as part of his legacy.
Yeah, it was very striking that he said basically, judge my government, inter alia, in terms of how we respond to this disaster, both in terms of better quality housing, justice for the victims, and, many would say that's actually the least any Prime Minister can do. It is, I think, a matter of national shame that thousands of homes are still admitted by the government. The government does these regular updates of how many homes are still unsafe. Thousands and thousands are still unsafe, 7 years on from this disaster. And there is something else. Weirdly, this has been on my mind in other contexts recently. But my goodness, the wheels of British justice grind slowly. If this had happened in America, I have absolutely no doubt that relevant executives would be in prison by now. Companies would be massively fined, and essentially the system would have come down on those culpable like a ton of bricks. We are 7 years on, and justice in terms of the criminal courts, as the Prime Minister, is only now beginning. And we've just got to look at this system whereby, we have this presumption in this country that you can't start prosecuting until a judicial review of this sort has run its course. And that feels utterly wrong to me.
Yeah, because from now it's going to take some time. The CPS are saying probably no charges until the end of 2026 because of the sheer volume of evidence and the complexity of it. As you say, there have already been 7 years. Police are now investigating 19 companies and 58 individuals. And, one thing that it makes difficult, though, is, as Keir Starmer said, he doesn't want to say anything that will prejudice that case. So suddenly, it silences, to some extent, the amount of critique that you can actually have during this period. And obviously, everyone was talking about how important the families are to this whole process. They have said, not long ago, that their lives are on hold while those responsible walk free.
Yeah, and listening closely, of course, in the chamber itself. I mean, there are things that he clearly wants to move reasonably swiftly on. He's going to respond to this within 6 months. He wants to stop some of these firms being awarded contracts for further work, an expedition of addressing some of those buildings that still need their cladding removed. There are things that can be put in place relatively swiftly in the coming months, but it is that core response. And if you're trying to find a way where you change social culture, where you address some of the social questions that were raised so profoundly by this tragedy, without that moment, that day of justice that he referred to, it's hard, isn't it?
I mean, one of the interesting questions is this one related to what you might call social class, that if this had happened to a bunch of rich people or some powerful organisation's building had been burned down, you can bet the bottom dollar, we'd have seen swifter remediation and swifter justice. I mean, I'm still, as Anushka was saying earlier, I remember being up much of that night because we were, on social media, we were beginning to get messages through, texts through about what was going on at Grenfell, and many of us were just following it through the night and just feeling utterly horrified by the pictures and the reports at the time.
I remember hearing it from where I lived, even just the noise of some of it in the early morning light. It was just...
Absolutely. But then, the next day, when you've got these devastated families who've got nowhere to live, the failure of the local authority to put in place decent housing, it was actually genuinely heartbreaking, and I, choose that word advisedly. I mean, we just have. We just have to look at ourselves and our values. And 7 years on, are we absolutely confident that these tragedies are never precisely repeated? But we're absolutely confident we've got the structures in place, that could ensure that these, that people are looked after properly.
Well, I mean, it's interesting just to touch on some of the response that we've had from Grenfell United, the group of families that have been so bereaved and then subsequently so badly treated in many cases. There is a reading of the inquiry hiding in plain sight that speaks to both the damage done to Grenfell Tower and the wider damage done to Britain, and that goes exactly to the core of that point, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, what everyone wants is a solution, and they want action to actually happen. I mean, as Robert said, that kind of terrible overriding conclusion is that people died needlessly. They can't change that, but they can try and stop it happening again. And we have this kind of real issue with other buildings. One of the key recommendations is to set up a single regulatory body that is looked after by a single government department, because one of the things that has happened in the past is that several different departments have been dealing with different bits of it, and there's basically been incompetence across the board. I mean, one of the findings was that whilst there are cases of greed complicity, terrible behaviour. A lot of what's gone wrong is incompetence. But I just come back to that cost point, because when Labour went into this election, we talked a lot about, you know, the Institute for Fiscal Studies saying there was a conspiracy of silence around it, and now Keir Starmer says and repeatedly says...
Around the public finances.
Around the public finances, sorry. And Keir Starmer now says, oh, it's this £22 billion black hole means suddenly we've got to put taxes up, as if, you know, that's the thing that's changed, and we can have an argument about whether that's a black hole or not. What they knew was they knew the Grenfell Inquiry was coming, and they knew a lot of other things. They already actually knew the amount that they'd have to spend on the contaminated blood scandal. They know that the post office scandal is coming. If you're going to be realistic about these things, the answer to them is going to cost a lot of money. And I think about this is Angela Rayner's department. That department is also dealing with the thing we've talked about lots, which is councils,
just
and
providing
holding
the
them
housing,
up, and them just holding them afloat. And I just think the amount that it's going to take to actually find solutions to this are very hard. And although they have responded to phase 1 recommendations, I find it hard to see how they are going to fully respond to these recommendations without some very serious changes in terms of public finances.
I mean, I think that is absolutely right. It was very interesting hearing Rishi Sunak, leader of the opposition, saying that when he was Chancellor, he allocated £1 billion to the first phase of fixing these buildings. Many people would say that is nowhere near enough. He said that, he implied that the Tories would support if there was a further allocation, but it comes against the backdrop of infrastructure in this country crumbling, whether it is, you know, that totally inappropriate cement concrete that's been used in schools and hospitals that needs to be replaced, you know, whether it is, frankly, a rail network, which many would say is not fit for purpose. Everywhere you look, and this is also to the private sector, we have underinvested for years and years and years. And frankly, whether or not you want to define the 22 billion as a black hole, or, you know, the kind of thing that governments basically, you know, paper over in the run-up to an election, whether you want to see it as this great moral failure as Sunak wants us to see it, or as something a bit more conventional, nonetheless not great. It's a drop in the ocean of what this country requires if we're going to bring our public services and our infrastructure up to scratch. And one of the reasons why this so-called fiscal event, this budget coming up at the end of October, is going to be so important. But we don't yet get any kind of a sense of whether this government fully appreciates the magnitude of the problem and how much money, not just to make good the deficiencies shown by Grenfell, but just the deficiencies all over the place, that frankly, if we're going to, you know, give us the public services we require, enormous amounts of money are going to have to be spent, and we don't yet know where the money is coming from.
And obviously their whole kind of focus is economic growth, as we've again talked about a lot. The question is, how much of that will they unlock to do this? And you were mentioning this, but they have all these mission boards in government, and the cabinet all sit on it. And at the first growth mission board, they were talking about things that we've talked about, planning reforms. Apparently they were talking about whether there could be some trade opportunities with Gulf states, for example. But also, something Robert was mentioning before, they want to host this huge investment event
Summit, yeah.
this autumn to try and unlock money for this. But I don't know if you think it's going to unlock anything like what is needed.
I mean, look, the private sector will invest in projects which earn a return. I'm sure there is more that can be done in terms of reforming rules for our pension funds and giving overseas investors certainty about the planning regime here, which can get some more private sector money in. But let's be absolutely clear, fixing the housing stock for poor people, people on low incomes, I'm afraid the private sector is not going to make the return that they would want out of that. That is money that taxpayers are going to have to provide. Fixing our crumbling hospitals, that is money that taxpayers are going to have to provide. So yeah, it's brilliant, because private sector investment in this country has been below that of our competitors for decades. It's great to try and get that up. It is great to try and get sort of venture capital funds and, you know, Canadian pension funds and Australian pension funds to invest in the UK. Perfectly sensible thing to do, but it ain't going to fix public services.
And the consequence of not fixing those public services then hinders what Sir Keir Starmer was addressing so sort of potently, really, in what he said there, is just fixing this sense of social justice. I mean, there is a direct political consequence of not being able to achieve that, and at some pace.
And as he's just said, judge me on it.
Judge me on
So he's got 5 years to be judged on that. And on the one hand, it is that delivery. Can you actually make the money, put the money into it, make people feel safe in their own homes? The other side is that accountability. And it will happen in the first term, if it is the first term of a Labour government, that there will be charges brought. But it is just going to be astonishing that will be 9 years. 9 years since it happened.
Yeah, and if the criminal justice system does deliver on that basis, clearly now he was being very cautious around the language that he chose in that statement there. This is going to be one of these debates that it will become a bit of a touchstone potentially. There will be other moments, won't there? There may be charges. We've got to see the criminal justice now system, see whether it can move at any pace to do this. It's going to sort of be one of those things that we'll be able to trace through this government potentially.
And I think the thing that really matters is that today isn't one of those days where leaders feel, oh my God, it's all shaming for the British state and therefore we'll stand up and be counted. But actually, in reality, they just move on to other more popular things. I mean, I was genuinely a bit upset actually when I looked at the chamber. Actually, vast numbers of MPs simply left after Prime Minister's questions. That was not, I thought for this statement, it would be bursting at the seams with MPs. It wasn't. There were lots and lots of empty seats there. And I was quite shocked by that, actually. Yeah. I mean, this was one of Grenfell, for I think anybody, who's not a child, was one of the defining moments in this country's history of the last 30 years. And I just assumed every MP would want to be here, be in the chamber to hear it, and they weren't.
Yeah, and not least because the families were there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought that was really quite shocking.
Very weird.
Yeah. Well, it was, I mean, it will dominate now for days, the news and political debate. This also came at a moment, we've just got a couple of moments when we ought to perhaps just reflect on some of those other issues that were raised during Prime Minister's questions. And actually, they do dovetail with some of the issues highlighted or as a consequence of the Grenfell report, is what could be coming in the budget, what financial pressures there are on the government, and what decisions that they are already taking. And the winter fuel allowance was straight up there in the first question from Rishi Sunak.
But I have to say, it's one of those occasions where, you might... we've had some pretty weird speeches from the Tory candidates. Later on this afternoon, we will have the number of Tory candidates to be leader whittled down, maybe by one, maybe by two. There are 6 candidates at the moment. It slightly depends on how many of them pass the sort of minimum threshold. But, we're going to see that list come down. But frankly, a lot of their speeches, I don't think it'd be particularly cutting through. Whereas I thought Sunak was pretty good today. I mean, I was thinking to myself, maybe he should put himself on. I don't think he wants to. I think he's had enough. But actually, making that contrast between, Starmer's decision to pay quite a lot more money to the striking railway workers, paying them a lot more money, but taking money away from pensioners in terms of abolishing the universal entitlement to this winter fuel payment. Actually, I think that was quite an effective attack that Sunak made. What do you think?
I think it's a really difficult narrative for Labour, this idea that they're hitting pensioners, not least because they now need to find taxes to raise. And they've said they won't raise VAT, national insurance, income tax, or corporation tax, which is 3/4 of all taxes, which leaves them not very many options. Do you know what the best option is? Pension tax allowance. If they hit pension, tax allowance in the budget, it's another thing that's hitting pensioners. You can see this narrative really.
It's hitting people who are saving now for a pension. It's not hitting people who are currently drawing a pension. It's a different. That is a tax increase on the working population. It's a backdoor way of raising income tax for millions of people.
Okay.
And I mean, it will certainly be controversial if he does does it, and will have very big economic. But he is attacking a different. He would be.
It's not the same people
punishing a
who
different group of people.
Okay.
And then, of course, I did think actually, because because we've lived through the last few months of how painful this issue is, not just for millions of people in the country, but also in the House of Commons. I also thought that Sunak handled the question of whether the government was right to revoke export licences, about 30 export licences for export of military equipment to Israel. I thought he handled that in really quite a difficult subject, but I think he did handle it in a way that I thought made life quite difficult for Starmer.
Yeah, and what did you make of the Prime Minister's response to it?
So this is classic Starmer, right, what we just saw. And we also saw it actually weirdly in the response to Grenfell. He is, from the sort of top of his head to the tips of his toes, he's a lawyer, right? And so much of what he says he's doing is conditioned by what he says the law tells him to do. He said very explicitly that he didn't have a choice whether or not to revoke those licences on exports to Israel, because the legal advice from inside government was there was a very sizable risk that Israel, in the way that it's conducted its campaign in Gaza, is in breach of international humanitarian law. So he's saying, the lawyer in me said I couldn't have made a difference. But as Anushka has been pointing out, actually, ultimately, this is a political judgment. It is not a legal decision.
Yeah, because when David Cameron was Foreign Secretary, the advice, which we saw, in fact, we got leaks of it, said the same thing. It said that Israel had breached international humanitarian law. The decision then was a political one. Did David Cameron believe that specific arms that were being sold would be used as part of breaching international law? And David Cameron made the decision that just because Israel had breached international humanitarian law previously, it wasn't necessarily going to do so again. So it is ultimately a political decision, but Keir Starmer was reaching for a legal explanation. And it is just worth remembering that while it has huge geopolitical consequences, potentially, for him in terms of the way this is seen by the US and Israel, he also has a lot of people in this country who probably left Labour at the last election who really want to see them take action like this.
Yeah, this is an issue which will not go away, for sure. We know that, of course, Grenfell will dominate, but even just touching on those two key issues gives us a bit of a handle on just how thorny an autumn could be facing this Prime Minister. Thank you, both of you, very much for navigating all of that back to PMQs and the most important report of the day, of course, the Grenfell Tower Inquiry report, and there'll be much more discussion on that to come. The most heartbreaking line from that report, of course, was that all of those 72 deaths were avoidable. Well, we will be back next Wednesday at 11:50 a.m. live here on ITVX. But for now, from all of us here, bye-bye.